Well, hello again, and welcome everybody to a great webinar in our webinar series from the EU Values Network. I'm Emily Jones, your host and moderator, and today we're very pleased to welcome Kurt Weyland, a Mike Hogg Professor in Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Weyland is a leading scholar in comparative politics with a distinguished career exploring democratization, authoritarianism, populism, and policy diffusion across Latin America and Europe. He's written several notable books on communism, fascism, and authoritarianism, and his extensive field research and work in Latin America has been published in top journals, including World Politics and the Journal of Democracy. His insight into the resilience of democratic institutions amid populist challenges are especially pertinent to our discussion today as he introduces his latest book titled Democracy's Resilience to the Threat of Populism, which was published last year, 2024, with Cambridge University Press. And joining him today is Dr. Adam Hollish, Research Fellow at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies, where he coordinates several EU-funded projects, including this one, the EU Values Network. And so in addition to our network's activities, Dr. Hollish's research focuses on democratic backsliding, rule of law, and multi-level governance in Europe, with particular attention to the EU's response to authoritarian trends in member states. Together, Professor Weyland and Dr. Hollish will offer us some valuable insights today for our ongoing exploration of democracy and governance. So thank you both for today. And well, just to say before we begin, this webinar is hosted by the EU Values Network, which is a collaborative Jean Monnet initiative. If you appreciate today's work or indeed like anything we do, we'd be very grateful if you could follow or subscribe to us on social media. We are on Blue Sky, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify. You can head to our website and find out more. And actually on our website, you can also subscribe to our mailing list, and we have a quarterly newsletter, which is about to go next week. So if you're quick on that one. Right, okay. Well, without further ado, I will now hand over to our presenter for today's session, Professor Kurt Weyland. Over to you.
Good. Thank you for having me in this series and for the very generous introduction. So what I want to do is present this book, which is motivated by the tremendous concern that people had about populism's impact on democracy. Arguably, populism nowadays is the biggest threat to democracy. And so you see, of course, a number of studies in recent years that have highlighted that threat. Most famous is Steve Levitsky and Daniel Sieblert's How Democracies Die. And you saw the black cover and the capital letter die. And so there's a lot of concern. And of course, you can easily think of emblematic cases where populist leaders have actually suffocated democracy. Alberto Fujimori of Peru, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, Viktor Orban of Hungary, Erdogan of Turkey. These examples easily come to mind. But if you want to get a sense of the real threat, the probability of populism undermining democracy, you can, of course, not only look at the cases where that bad outcome has happened. What you need to do is you need to do a comprehensive assessment of populist leaders and see how many of those actually do destroy democracy. So that's what I did in this book. I looked at 40 populist chief executives in Latin America and Europe, the two regions where populism is most widespread, over the last 40 years. And I assessed how many of those actually really suffocated democracy and pushed their countries into authoritarian rule. And what I found is that of those 40 leaders, 7 did this. Now, that finding has two sides. On the one hand, it's not that common that populist leaders actually destroy democracy. 7 out of 40, that's a mortality rate of 18%. So a lot of democracies survive in settings that are comparatively weak in institutional terms. But of course, also, you have a number of democracies that actually do get destroyed. And so what you see is the two sides of populism. It's a real problem. It's a real threat. It endangers democracy. But it seems that that threat, that peril, doesn't always come to full fruition. And so what I try to do in this book is, on the one hand, explain the threat, where does it come from? And then also investigate the conditions under which populism actually destroys democracy. So, for both of those two sides of the question, I start from my political strategic definition of populism. Populism is often defined, especially in Europe, in a more ideational, discourse, ideological way. What I think is a political strategic definition that focuses on what populists actually do, how they act, I think is better, especially for an investigation of the impact of populism on democracy. So, that political strategic definition, if you excuse two terms of political science jargon, that political strategic definition says that populism revolves around personalistic plebiscitarian leadership. It focuses on leaders, the populist leaders, and it focuses on those leaders who combine two special features. Personalistic, these big, mostly men who claim that they have a lot of prowess, an important mission, that they can do what they think is necessary to do, that they shouldn't be hindered by institutions, courts, and whatever. And so what you see from that feature of personalism, that feature shows that populism by nature runs up against liberal democracy, because liberal democracy thinks about institutions, thinks about constraints. Liberal democracy does not want to have overpowering leaders, does not want to headstrong leaders who do whatever they want to do. And so you see from that feature of personalism, populism is inherently a problem for democracy. It puts pressure, it creates a threat for the liberal institutions. The second feature is what I call plebiscitarianism. And what that means is this: many populist leaders are outsider. Most of them do not have anything resembling a structured party. So how do they mobilize and maintain support? They try to reach their followers in a very direct way. They try to have a direct connection to the leaders that bypasses intermediaries. So there isn't an organized party structure where different levels of party members are tied in to an organizational network. But the populist leader directly tries to mobilize, talk to, connect to people. Initially, Juan Perón, million people in the plaza in front of the presidential palace. Then TV, Hugo Chavez had this TV show that for hours he was directly in the living room of lots of people. Donald Trump, tweet, 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 tweet. You know, whenever you opened your phone, you were directly connected with Donald Trump. Now, that direct outreach, that direct appeal is not organized, it's not institutionalized, and so it's not very solid. It's feeble. It depends on whether populist leaders have that charisma, have that appeal, whether people find the magnetism actually effective. So, from the perspective of populist leaders, that's problematic because they might be on top of the world and then lose support fairly quickly because there isn't a solid organizational linkage. To counteract that, what populist leaders do, they try to supercharge their appeals by depicting themselves as saviors of the people while denigrating other politicians, the democratic opposition, not as legitimate competitors, but as enemies of the people, as nefarious, corrupt, dangerous, and whatever. So populist leaders, by nature, foment confrontation, polarization, that turn democratic politics into a war. And that's very bad for democracy because it means they're tempted to, for example, harass the opposition, limit what the opposition can do, empower themselves, skew the playing field. And so you see from that feature of plebiscitarianism, the perceived need to supercharge that appeal, to foment confrontation, that this also runs up against liberal democracy. So the political strategic definition of populism shows that populism inherently, by nature, is a problem for democracy. Okay? And so in a number of cases, populism actually does destroy democracy and push the country into authoritarian rule. But as I mentioned, in more than 80% of the cases, that does not happen. So what we need to do is we need to investigate the conditions. Under what conditions do some Few. Populist leaders manage to strangle democracy, and what are the conditions under which they can't do that? So that, again, in some sense, heuristically is suggested by the political strategic definition of populism, because when you think of it, the personalistic character of populist leadership means when institutions are firm, when institutions are solid, populist leaders have a limited margin of maneuver. They can't do too much damage to democracy because they're constrained. So turn that around. One of the necessary conditions for the populist destruction of democracy in my research is some type of institutional weakness. When institutions are weak, and I measure that, I assess that at the beginning of a populist leader's term, before they come to power, if institutions are weak to begin with, then populist leaders have more room, more space to follow their personalistic expansion, their power concentration. They can do more damage to democracy. So, institutional weakness is a necessary condition for the populist destruction of democracy. But what you see is, and my research in Latin America and Europe, especially Eastern Europe, shows that even a number of democracies that suffer from certain institutional weaknesses survive populists in government. So there has to be another factor that is decisive to enable populist leaders to push aside institutions, even if these institutions are already weak. And that is where the second feature of my political strategic definition of democracy comes in, namely plebiscitarian support. What I find is that populist leaders can only really concentrate power to a dangerous extent. They can only suffocate democracy if they have overwhelming, massive popular support. Recent case, Bukele in El Salvador, 85, 90% support. Who is going to resist that? I mean, there's no opposition that can withstand the onslaught of a populist leader with a groundswell of 80, 85, 90% support. When Fujimori in Peru made his self-coup, he got 80% approval. Nobody's going to resist that. Hugo Chavez, often at 65, 70, even higher level of approval. Very hard to resist that. But what I find is achieving that degree of massive support, overwhelming support, is not very easy. It depends on objective given conditions. What my research finds is that populist leaders can achieve that massive support only when they encounter objectively given conjunctural opportunities. Conjunctural opportunities that come in two different types. One is easier to understand. It is a huge revenue windfall. Huge revenue windfall, which, for example, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela get from the commodities boom, given that Venezuela is a big oil exporter. So the commodities boom gifted Hugo Chavez billions and billions and billions of dollars. For that, you roll out generous social programs, you hire a whole bunch of middle-class people in the public administration. You extend juicy contracts to business people. You can, if you want to use a crass term, buy massive support. And you can see that with Hugo Chavez in early 2003, before the global commodities boom, he had 30% approval. The global commodities boom really takes off 2003, 2004. He does these things like huge social programs, and his popularity rises to 65, 70% support. And with that overwhelming support, he managed to destroy democracy. So one of the types of given exogenous conjunctural opportunities that enables a populist leader to achieve the big support in order to destroy democracy is this massive windfall, a gain in some sense. Paradoxically, the other type of conjunctural opportunity is in many ways the opposite. It is an acute and severe but resolvable crisis, because if a populist leader encounters an exogenely given crisis, and that populist leader can resolve that crisis, that turns that populist leader into the savior of the people. People are so happy about averting further losses, reversing recent losses, that they give this populist savior a massive outpouring of support. One type of crisis that is very amenable for this kind of populist leader is hyperinflation. Hyperinflation, I define it strictly as 50% price increases per month. 50% price increase per month is terrible for everybody. So a ton of people suffer. They need salvation. If a populist leader, however, can, with a drastic adjustment program, bring down hyperinflation very quickly, and people are relieved. People are so happy that somebody overcame this problem and therefore give a populist leader an outpouring of support. So you can see that severe and acute but resolvable crises also enable a populist leader to win this massive support. So we saw some type of institutional weakness is a necessary condition, but that has to come together as another necessary condition with a exogenously given conjunctural opportunity. And only when those two factors coincide, both necessary conditions, only then do you have the sufficient conditions for the populist destruction of democracy. What the book does then is, so those are the two basic factors. The book then differentiates and distinguishes, for example, different types of institutional weakness. Here, I focus especially on a country's system of government. And what I argue is that a parliamentary system, how many European countries have it, creates a certain type of institutional weakness, because the fact that the prime minister is based on a majority in parliament means that checks and balances, that the separation of powers is attenuated among the three branches of government. The executive branch and the legislative branch, majority in parliament elects, sustains the prime minister, are in the same boat. That means the real veto player is only the judiciary. And so, institutionally speaking, parliamentary systems have a certain weakness. It's an argument that is very different from the Juan Linz argument about parliamentarism versus presidentialism, but that's what I find, and that's what you can see in East European cases like Orban and Erdogan. Parliamentarism facilitates the populist destruction of democracy. Wittgenstein parliamentarism, of course, emphasizes that party fragmentation is an important constraint, but we'll see how that plays out in the cases where democracy gets destroyed. So one type of institutional weakness is parliamentarism. A presidential system of government, in principle, doesn't have that, because there are three independent branches of government. Many presidential systems in Latin America are bicameral. You have different veto players. In principle, that creates more constraints on populist leadership. But in a number of Latin American countries, presidents can, with impunity, exceed their official constitutional attributions. So, for example, in one country, the constitution foresees degrees of necessity and urgency. And in the 160 years of independence, there had been about 30 of these degrees, really only in emergencies. Comes a president and says, oh, there's a ton of necessity and urgency here, passes one decree after the other. Is it legal? Is it not? Is it constitutional? Is it not? It's sort of a gray zone. And so in that way, presidents can exceed their attributions. They can arrogate more power. It's a certain type of institutional weakness that a number of presidential systems in Latin America have. But because it's not clearly legal, not clearly illegal, these kinds of arrogations of power provoke a lot of pushback, friction, conflict. So you can extend to a certain extent, but it's hard for you to overthrow the whole constitution, to really push your country in that way into competitive authoritarianism. You can only do so if you have special conjunctural opportunities that we see, okay? Now, there are some situations in Latin America where a presidential system has been battered by serious constitutional crises, by serious challenges. Venezuela before Hugo Chavez, two dangerous coup attempts, then the politicized impeachment of a president. Ecuador before Rafael Correa, three presidents got booted out in very, very legally problematic ways. One actually in a coup, one was declared mentally incompetent with no evidence. So when a presidential system has suffered through a number of these serious constitutional crises, I quote that presidential system as suffering from high instability, battered, punctured, undermined. A constitution like that is brittle and fairly easy to overthrow. So what I'm saying in that book is there are three types of institutional weakness. The medium level of institutional weakness are these presidential systems where presidents can arrogate more power, but there's friction. Weaker are the parliamentary systems where the prime minister has a majority in parliament and has fairly open path forward. And the weakest are the presidential systems that suffer from high instability. So after making the distinction of different types and levels of institutional weakness, what the book does is it looks at how these types of institutional weakness combine with conjunctural opportunities. And what I find is that there are three different paths towards the populist destruction of democracy that happen to coincide with three well-known types of populism that regional experts have distinguished. So you see the left-wing, so-called Bolivarian populists in Latin America, Hugo Chavez, Rafael Correa, Evo Morales in Bolivia. And what you see there were about 10, 12 of these left-wing populists in Latin America. Three destroyed democracy, Chavez, Morales, and Correa. And that happened because they took over when their country had suffered from high instability. I told you, Hugo Chavez, there were two coup attempts before, politicized impeachment. When Hugo Chavez took over, the Venezuelan constitution was very feeble, very weak. Hugo Chavez immediately made an assault on that constitutional framework. Very controversial, highly conflictual. It seemed that Hugo Chavez was going to lose on a number of occasions. He was actually booted out in a coup for 2 days, so very precarious. But what saved Hugo Chavez and what doomed Venezuelan democracy was that in 2003, the global commodities boom kicked off. As I told you a few minutes ago, Hugo Chavez savvily used it to roll out big social programs, hire a ton of people from the middle class to administer these programs, buy off business with juicy contracts, and his popularity rose to very high levels. And with that, he managed to strangle Venezuelan democracy. And so what you see is this, for these left-wingers in Latin America, what is decisive is the combination of high instability and a huge revenue windfall. The book compares the cases where populism was destroyed, Venezuela under Chavez, Ecuador under Correa, Bolivia under Evo Morales, with a number of other cases where you had left-wing populists who didn't benefit either from high instability or from a massive windfall, and those populists failed in their pressures on democracy. Lucio Gutierrez in Ecuador took over before the global commodities boom. He was a left-winger. He looked almost like Chavez, didn't have the resources, fell by the wayside. So the book compares this, compare, contrast, and demonstrates that it's only the combination of high instability and a big windfall that enables left-wing populists in Latin America to strangle democracy. Europe. So these are left-wingers, and you can see why a windfall is important for left-wingers, because left-wingers want to alleviate poverty, they want to alleviate inequality, they want to boost popular well-being. Well, for that you need money, you need resources. So a windfall is, a really golden opportunity for a left-winger. Right-wingers campaign on order and stability. And so what is crucial for right-wingers is a crisis that in many ways provides an opportunity to restore order and stability and demonstrate their prowess and their charisma and win support in the way that I told you, overcoming losses. People are so relieved, big outpouring of support. That played out in Europe, especially Eastern Europe under Viktor Orban and Erdogan in Turkey, because both of those were elected after a big, sharp economic recession, like the global crisis of 2008 hit Hungary. It dismantled the government, it dismantled established parties. Orban wins a super majority in 2010. Super majority has control of the legislature, control of the executive branch, makes a new constitution in almost perfectly legal ways, undermines and abolishes democracy. You see, parliamentarism opens up a smooth path for the populist asphyxiation of democracy. Many people for many years argued that Poland, PiS, Kaczynski in Poland were on the same path as Hungary. You see a similar ideology, a similar assault on democracy. What I always highlighted is its big difference because in Poland, there was no preceding economic crisis. So in Poland, PiS won a tiny, 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 very narrow majority. They couldn't do what Orban did in completely legal ways. They resorted to pushing and shoving. They resorted to tricks. They resorted to manipulation, provoked a lot of pushback, a lot of friction, a lot of opposition, and they lost re-election in 2023. Orban, re-elected, re-elected, re-elected. The country really sinks into competitive authoritarianism. Why? Sharp economic crisis, big majority, you can move ahead. Poland, no economic crisis, very, very, very narrow majority, you can't move ahead and you lose re-election. And so you see, it's only the combination of a sharp crisis that eliminates partisan veto players, and then by gifting a majority to a populist prime minister enables the populist destruction of democracy. Last type of populism, which is the right-wingers, what people, especially neoliberal populism in Latin America, Fujimori, Menem, Uribe, Collor in Brazil. Those leaders took office in presidential systems where arrogations of power were possible, but presidential systems that still provided a whole bunch of constraints on populist leadership. So what you see in those cases, it is only the exceptional combination of two severe and acute but resolvable crises that enabled the populist destruction of democracy. The only one of those who destroyed democracy until recently, Bukele, the only one was Fujimori in Peru. And in my argument, why was he able to do that? Because Fujimori, when he was elected in 1990, he faced both hyperinflation and a massive guerrilla war. And Fujimori managed to end hyperinflation and to defeat the guerrilla by capturing its leadership. So Fujimori was a superhero. He had taken on and he had resolved two serious crises. He won 80% approval for his self-coup. Nobody could resist him. And you can see how this works out because there are very clear contrast cases. There was Carlos Menem in Argentina who faced hyperinflation but no guerrilla war. He eventually managed to end hyperinflation. People were happy. People enabled him to win a re-election. But when his second term came to an end, he wanted to be re-elected again. And it was like, no, time's up, over. He didn't face a guerrilla movement. His popularity was 55-60%, didn't reach that overwhelming level, and therefore he was limited and couldn't destroy democracy. He put some pressure, there was some backsliding, but democracy then recovered when he had to comply with the two-term limit and step aside. The contrast case is Alvaro Uribe in Colombia, who took over in 2002, facing a dangerous guerrilla movement, but no hyperinflation. Uribe combated, in many ways, defeated the guerrilla movement, but there was no hyperinflation. And that meant that he also won a re-election. He won a second term. Second term comes up. He wants to be re-elected again. No, the court said no, and he had to respect it. So you see from those contrast cases, only the coincidence of two serious, acute, and severe crises enabled one of these neoliberal populists, Fujimori, to destroy democracy. One crisis, hyperinflation in Argentina, guerrilla war in Colombia, wasn't sufficient to do this. And so you see how restrictive, how difficult it is for populist leaders to destroy democracy. So the conclusion of my argument is that populists can destroy democracy only when they face pre-existing conditions, some type of institutional weakness. And then what is especially important is these special conjunctural opportunities. And those special conjunctural opportunities are exceptional. They don't come around very easily. Massive windfall from the global commodities boom, hyperinflation, big guerrilla movements. So the finding then is that the populism is a problem, populism is a threat, but that threat only comes to fruition under special circumstances. Democracy is stronger, more resilient, even in systems that suffer from weaknesses than many people think. Now, very briefly, at the end, what does that imply for the advanced industrialized countries? My book has two chapters on Latin America, the two different types of populism, the left-wingers, the right-wingers, one chapter on Europe, and then a whole chapter on the United States under President Trump, of course, the first term. And my argument is, so preconditions, necessary conditions for the populist destruction of democracy are both some real institutional weakness and some very special conjunctural opportunity. Now you apply that to the United States, firm institutional framework. There has been some erosion due to polarization, but the US institutional framework, checks and balances, autonomous, powerful judiciary, federalism, that is another type of institutional constraint. There are so many institutional obstacles, institutional complications for the populist destruction of democracy that I think the United States is quite firm just based on that one factor in my argument. All of that, the institutional strength of the US system, is sustained by a constitution that is practically impossible to change. I told you that among the 40 populist chief executives that are investigated, 7 of those destroyed democracy. 5 of those, early in their term, enacted a profound change of the constitution, which in many ways was the break point, what enabled them to then suffocate democracy. So, big constitutional transformation in the United States, out of the question, out of the question. And so in institutional terms, the United States is quite in, relatively safe territory. Then you look at these conjunctural opportunities. I mean, the US economy is so diversified and so prosperous. There is no way that there would be a massive windfall. You can have that in Venezuela when an economy depends on oil. The United States, there's just absolutely no way that a massive windfall would suddenly gift a populist leader with the opportunity to buy this huge support. Then you think about crises. And it's not going to be a big guerrilla movement cruising around the Rocky Mountains, in Peru, the guerrilla movement controlled about half the territory, absolutely out of the question. Economic crises. In principle, yes. But what you see is this. Think, for example, about COVID. COVID imposed a massive economic downturn on the United States, big jump in unemployment, a massive, lockdown of economic activity. The United States, like other advanced industrialized countries, has so much fiscal capacity that they pass these huge compensatory measures such that in 2020, during the big COVID crisis, average incomes were higher than before. So yes, there can be a crisis, but you have such fiscal capacity to compensate for it, so it doesn't have nearly the same devastating impact like hyperinflation had in Latin American countries. So my argument is the United States is not subject to either one of the necessary conditions for the populist destruction of democracy. Still, a good deal of institutional strength, no chance for these special conjunctural opportunities, despite Donald Trump's transgressive, aggressive, comprehensive push in his second term that is submitting the US system to a serious stress test, more serious than I had anticipated. I think the US system will hold, it is holding. Right now, with Donald Trump's many executive orders, there are 250 court cases that are contesting, that are limiting. A whole bunch of judges have said, no, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. You are limited. And so for those reasons, I think the United States, even the United States is safe. We can discuss it in the Q&A. I think European countries are even safer because in West European countries, the party system, I think, will serve as political veto players that can compensate for the institutional weakness of parliamentarism. And so fortunately, despite all of the concern, populism is a problem. Populism is a threat, but the threat is not quite as dangerous as many people have depicted it. The threat is not as dangerous even in weaker systems like Latin America and Eastern Europe. In particular, I think Western democracies, North America, Western Europe, have a ton of resilience, a ton of strength. I think they will survive the serious pressures, as you see in the United States now, serious pressures that populist leaders can subject them to. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Let me just remove the spotlight there. That was so interesting to learn about the nuances, I suppose, of the conditions that really make populism a threat, with all the examples you gave and the US stress test there at the end as well. Very interesting. Just to remind our audience here today that if you have questions for Kurt on this book or indeed any of his research, there is a Q&A box function at the bottom of this. So yeah, do start writing in your questions there and we'll come to those in a little bit. So first we'll turn to our expert discussant with us today, Dr. Adam Hollish, for his thoughts and reflections on the book. Over to you, Adam.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. Thank you very much, Professor Weyland, for this excellent presentation. I'm a big fan of your work, therefore, right, it'd be biased here. It's a very well-written book, right? 260 pages. It goes in 1 or 2 sessions, right? It remembers me of the book. Now you mentioned him a lot, Juan Lins and all the other big scholars on comparative politics, right? It's something like a continuation. You see your expertise on populism, but you work on this topic so many decades, right? And also your expertise on Latin America, and therefore, now my comments would be maybe how we can connect, because EU Values is also a project now about the European values, European Union, and some of the question you already answered, right, in your final comments after the presentation of your book. But I will come back to that, right? And I will present my ideas in a block, right? And then at the end I will try to address an open question, which you, if you have time, you could answer. Right, so the main argument, just to summarize, you said it already, populism is a recurring phenomenon, appeared in many regions of the world. It is dangerous, however, it is not the death of liberal democracy, right? And I like also how you introduced Ziblatt and Lewinsky, which are right now quoted everywhere, right? It's not if democracies die, now they say how they can die, and then in fact, when you look at the numbers, they don't really die, only some, no? And you look, no, but this is very fresh, and you look at the other side. What can we do, right? As protection of democracy is also showing the weaknesses of populism, right? And I think your book is excellent in that. No, and your approach is, like always in your work, if populism is not only an idea, but rather a strategy, it's all about leaders, right? And you introduced the main arguments here. you say, but there could be something like a democratic decline in the world, but we shouldn't give up because, right, we can. The main argument is we can win against the populists, right? This is what you say. No, and my first question maybe for later, now because you look at the period of 3-4 decades, aren't we maybe right now in a new period which is a little bit more dangerous in the last 8-9 years? For example, right, I'm coming from the European studies, and I will come back to it later. But this is the main question behind my questions. Now, for example, you give 3 combinations when liberal pluralism is really in danger. So you call it, no, and I like it, hydrocarbon windfalls in presidential systems suffering from high instability, like Venezuela, Bolivia. Then coincident of economic crisis and security crisis, right? Again, Latin America, Peru, El Salvador. And then in Europe, economic crisis, right? Something like what happened in Hungary in Orban, Turkey under Erdogan. To Hungary, one thing now, I'm working a little bit on Hungary. Hungary could be also, and this is a question, could you interpret it or could you introduce something like crisis of trust? Now, because we have this famous quote of Ferenc Gyurcsány, who was the former prime minister, who said, whose recordings came out saying, but he lied to the Hungarian people in the morning and in the evening. Now, and that was the push. Also, besides the economic crisis, why Orban won, and then, right, he was able to take over power and consolidate this populist power. And then another idea here about the reasons why this happens, not because your work is focusing a lot on Latin America, right? In Latin America, populism was somehow an answer to inequality. And right now we see a growing inequality also in Europe, in the US. Aren't this, but maybe what was happening in Latin America right now is happening in Europe, in the US. Now the famous 1% inequality, everyone sees what's going on, right? Even the billionaires don't care anymore to hide the stuff. Even here, you could maybe, I don't want to defend Donald Trump, but it's maybe an argument, but even Donald Trump seems to address this elephant curve of Branko Milanovic, right? Where the working class in the US and the middle class in the US and Europe now is suffering due to the globalization, or is not the winner, and the winner are, for example, in China, and this is something like a reaction. Then about now you say that compared to Linz, maybe parliamentary system are not so superior, no? Like Linz was arguing, and here you show it excellent on the case of Hungary, right? But could we maybe distinguish here between coming to power and maintaining power, right? Because I think what I really like in Lisz's work is that he shows that in presidential systems are more dangerous at the beginning due to this election of an outsider. In a parliamentary system, it's very difficult that the populist outsider grabs power, right? And this happened, for example, with Viktor Orban. He started as a liberal with a Soros stipendium, then became a conservative, right? And then finally, once in power, he had this far-right turn, right? So is it maybe that we should distinguish more between coming to power and maintaining power? Then another comment is on strong leaders. And here I have 2 points. No, because you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it's not so much in the book, but it was a presentation about the toxic masculinity. No, but in Europe, we see, but maybe the far-right populist is changing its face. I mean, there are many studies showing, right, that on the lower levels, there is no influence of women at all. However, we have Marine Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni, and Alice Weidel right now, Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, right? How would you argue, what happened there? What changed here? And then are maybe populist or strong leaders recurring argument or something which is new everywhere in politics, not only populist leaders, because now I'm based in Spain, and when you think about Spain, about the success on the Socialist Party, it's Pedro Sanchez. It's his face. One, Pedro Sanchez is gone, I think the Socialist Party would apparently lose power. And also in Poland, because you mentioned a lot of Poland, winning against the populist, Jarosław Kaczyński, no, it was mainly due to Donald Tusk. Now, Donald Tusk had to come back from Brussels, leave the leadership of the European People's Party, right? So it was him as a person, right, with strong personality to win against populist leader. Then one thing about concepts, I would be interested in your point on that, not because you say that populism needs effort to suffocate democracy, but no, and at the beginning you talk that populists go against democracy, then you also mentioned that they go about liberalism. And here I would like to ask you about your stand on this point. Can the democracy be populist and in parts illiberal, or is it impossible? Right? Another comment, I'm slowly coming to the end. A very interesting finding at the tables, right? Where you provide all these conditions and all the populist leaders in the past. No, but what is very clear in this tables is that in Latin America the populists disappear, the populist leader disappears, and in Europe they apparently stick around, right? So they come and go. What would be your explanation for that here? And then maybe only my last point was on Donald Trump, so I will not say it because you explained it already in a very excellent manner. And something about case selection, two very minor points, not because you also say that personalistic leader make this direct personal contact with people. And when I think about this now, I'm working a lot on Russia. In this case, Putin would be also a populist, right? Because he has this. And if not, why not? Because he has this big TV show, right, for 5-6 hours when he has answers all the questions. And you're Russian, you can call him and ask President Putin, well, it's your point on that, right? And he really takes his time. And this is something like a mess. No, this is a ceremony of his authoritarian system, right? Maybe it's not a populist in this case because he's already went way too far. And one very minor comment that was made upon us, because I found it in a footnote when you were saying that Lech Kaczynski, there is a place for him in Warsaw when you visited him, like the heroes of Poland. It's even worse, right? So he lies at the Wawel Castle with Polish kings. No, so his brother was really insisting, but he gives a place close to the Polish king, and he lies there in Krakow, right? So this is very, very relevant. But thanks again, excellent book. I recommend it already for months to my students, right? It's part of our syllabus. So thank you very much. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Adam, for your insights and great questions there as well. Kurt, if you wish to respond to Adam's reflections or questions, go for it.
Well, how much time should I take? Have you gotten a lot of questions? How much time should I leave for questions from the audience?
No, we're okay for time, so
Okay,
as
good.
much as you like.
So thank you for all these comments and reflections. You raised a number of important points. Let me start with one thing at the end, the concept. There's always, populism is very hard to define. That's the reason why the definitional issues really haven't gone away. And I think you'll often have some cases that don't fit very comfortably. Now, in my view, Putin is not a populist because a populist leader rises based on this mass support, whereas Putin, of course, was installed from the top down by Yeltsin, so he rose, and his kind of base of power is very different. He wants to boost his popularity. He has this show, but it is not the main base of sustenance. Whereas for a populist leader, that is how they rise to power, and that is how they sustain themselves. And so from my perspective, Putin is not a populist. There can certainly be, you mentioned, for example, Donald Tusk. I mean, there can certainly be leaders that play an important role as personalities, and you can even have leaders who are charismatic, like Lula da Silva of Brazil. But I don't define them as populists because, like, Lula da Silva has a pretty well organized, strong party, and so the leader can play quite a role. There can be an emphasis on the the personalistic characteristics of the leader, but if it has more of an organized party, for me that doesn't count as populist. You raise a very interesting point. I mean, among the 40 leaders that I looked at, 39 were men. There was only Christina Fernandez de Kirchner, but we have seen some women leaders in populist movements like Marine Le Pen. I don't have a very good explanation how that works, because you have to have this kind of strength. So one of my former students, Caitlin Andrews Lee, who is at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, she's actually doing a project about female charismatic leadership. Under what conditions can women rise as charismatic leaders? That can, I think, one case that can account for is Marine Le Pen, because she's the daughter of Jean-Marie. Now it can't account for Meloni and Biden, and I'm not sure whether Biden has the kind of charismatic mass mobilizational feature that I would classify as a populist. But you see, a lot of leaders, they have some feature like personalism, but not necessarily the other feature. You raised a very big, important question about populism as the answer to inequality. And I think that is an important underlying factor that accounts for the rise of populist leaders. And so, I mean, clearly there are a whole bunch of important questions that my book doesn't address. My book is in some sense very much focused what happens after a populist leader takes office, and what do they do to democracy, how they come to power, and how they do that. I don't actually look at. Now, for the populist destruction of democracy, I don't think that inequality as such is an important factor to distinguish cases where democracy gets destroyed or not. I think it's a more important factor for the rise of populist leaders. But there you see, of course, it's a factor that doesn't have a very clear outcome, because as you mentioned, in Latin American countries, high inequality has led to the rise of a number of left-wing leaders. And there's a long argument that in Latin America, populism tends to come more from the left. It's, of course, not universally true, because you have had these right-wingers, Fujimori and Menem and Uribe, more recently Bolsonaro and Bukele. But in Latin America, inequality sort of makes it easier for left-wing populists to rise. The interesting thing, of course, is that in Europe and North America, the stronger populists are right-wingers. And so you can say that inequality plays a role in the election, like Trump's deplorables. I mean, you see how lower education has an impact on voting for Trump. The big issue is, of course, whether these right-wing populist leaders do anything to address or resolve inequality. I mean, in some sense, you can say they use inequality to get elected. And then you mentioned it by, for example, pointing to Donald Trump's policy towards China and tariffs, that distract attention from it. They don't resolve it. I mean, one thing about the United States is I think Donald Trump would be a lot more dangerous if he copied Orban more or peace in Poland by rolling out big social programs for a lot of these deplorables, if he actually allocated resources to them, if he helped them out. I mean, so Trump gets elected partly based on inequality, and then what is he doing to resolve it? Tax cuts in Medicaid. So Donald Trump is in some sense not that strategic in not taking advantage of the opportunity given by that inequality and saying, look, I'm taking care of you. I'm doing a program. I'm channeling funding to you. This thing about bringing back manufacturing is a chimera. That's a phantom. If he actually got over the sort of neoliberal aspect of the Republican Party and tax cuts and all that kind of thing, if he actually extended benefits to these groups, I think he could have much more support and would be more dangerous. So I can't respond to all the questions, but I tried to respond to some of them, so we leave a bit of time for any questions from the audience. But thank you very much for your comments, for your careful reading, and thank you very much for the nice things you said about this book. That makes me happy that you found it interesting and convincing. So
thank you. The students too, so not only me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you to Kurt and to Adam. Well, I also hope Donald Trump doesn't listen to the last part of what you just said. Like, no ideas for him
Please
there.
don't. I only have a green card. I'm not a US citizen. You know, I have lived here now. I
Yes.
live in fear.
Oh my. Well, we've had lots of thanks and well wishes in the chat. And okay, there's one question here for you relating to Trump, actually. Do you think Donald Trump will push for a third term if there is higher instability and some type of crisis?
Donald Trump talks about potentially running for a third term, but typically he goes back and forth and whatever. I mean, there is this 22nd constitutional amendment that says presidents can only be elected for two terms, and he couldn't even. I thought initially maybe there's a trick like in Latin America. He has some figurehead be the president, he's the vice president, gets elected, and then resigns. Even that wouldn't be. He couldn't be on the ballot as a vice president. So for Donald Trump to run for a third term, there would have to be a constitutional amendment is practically out of the question. There would have to be a massive breach of the US Constitution. I mean, that would be a real, and I just don't foresee it. I mean, you know, yes, Donald Trump appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, I mean, even these people, they're conservatives, they are rule bound. I cannot foresee that they would approve or condone a massive explicit breach of the Constitution. And in some sense, the fact that that Donald Trump appointed those 3 justices, I think that means that he couldn't easily disregard their ruling, you know, because they are his people, right? And so if they speak out and say a third term, forget it. Absolutely. I think he could not ignore that, given that in the United States, about 85% of all people, when asked, say the president has to comply with court orders. There have been a couple of surveys recently because of that issue, and a very large majority, even of Republican voters, say, no, 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 court orders, he has to comply. So I think the talk about a third term, I think it is politically strategic because, strictly speaking, Donald Trump right now is, in US terms, a lame duck because he can't get reelected. And so, you know, by US standards, especially after the midterms, there should be a lot of maneuvering for his succession. And I think he wants to dampen that because as soon as other leaders rise and position themselves for succession, his star is going down. And I think he wants to postpone that by, you know, talking about third term, so that people don't dare to kind of, I want to be your successor. So.
Indeed, very interesting. Yes. We also have one other question. Do you think left-wing populism will come back in Europe?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I mean, we have seen some left-wing populists, right? Tsipras in Greece and Podemos in Spain, or Podemos has been strikingly, you know, there was a lot of initial enthusiasm and excitement about Podemos, and it has really kind of imploded. So I'm not sure because you know, the big issue is migration. Migration will be a long-standing issue for European countries, partly because, you know, due to the age structure, Europe needs migrants, right? And so how you navigate that, the high economic and social need for migrants and the political cultural aversion of a number of people, I think that will give right-wing populists kind of fodder for their appeals for a while to come. And inequality, you know, is so, I don't think it's that easy to politicize in Europe. So, you know, very complex economies, societies that are very complex with many different classes, groups, status groups. You don't have kind of the, you know, the old kind of classes anymore that could really politicize this. So I wouldn't foresee a real upsurge of left-wing populism in Europe.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kurt. Thank you, Adam. This brings us to time, actually, for everybody. What a great conversation to have been a part of. Just to let everyone in the audience know that this will be on YouTube and on our website in coming days. So if you know of somebody that would also have enjoyed this conversation, please share it. And well, we'll also link to the book, The Democracy's Resilience to Populism's Threat. This will be linked on our website as well for anyone that hasn't got a copy. So well, on behalf of EU Values, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your expertise. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me and giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Adam, for the great questions and comments and for the very careful reading of the book. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you
Bye.
so much, everyone. Have a good
Yeah.
day.
Okay,
Bye.
bye. Yeah.